Good evening, dear friends. Welcome to a quiet corner of 1950s England, where a simple jar of marmalade hides a deadly secret. In the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead, old Dr. Haydock spreads fresh marmalade on his morning toast. One bite, and he falls dead. Everyone calls it a weak heart. But Miss Jane Marple sees what others miss. The jar was opened only for him. A long-buried grudge is about to surface, and someone in the village has waited years for this moment. Settle back and let us begin. The doctor's last breakfast. It was a bright April morning in 1953 when Dr. Edward Haydock sat down to his breakfast in the pleasant little dining room of Rose Cottage. The sun came slanting through the chintz curtains, making patterns on the white tablecloth, and the air smelled of toast and coffee. At 72, the doctor was still a tall, upright figure, though his shoulders had begun to stoop a little, and his hair had gone quite white. For more than 30 years, he had looked after the aches and pains of St. Mary Mead, and the villagers thought of him almost as one of their own. His housekeeper, Mrs. Pratt, a stout, sensible woman who had been with him for 15 years, brought in the tray herself. "There you are, Doctor," she said, setting it down with a comfortable clatter. "Fresh toast, and I've opened a new pot of marmalade for you. Mrs. Ledbetter sent it over yesterday, said it was her own making, from the oranges her sister brought from Spain. She thought you might like it." Dr. Haydock smiled. "Very kind of her. Tell her I said thank you when you see her." He took the pot, a plain glass jar with a handwritten label, and twisted the lid. It came off with a small, satisfying pop. The marmalade inside was a rich golden orange, thick with peel. He spread a generous layer on his buttered toast, took a large bite, and nodded with pleasure. "Excellent," he murmured. "Just the right sharpness." Mrs. Pratt went back to the kitchen, humming to herself. She had only just reached the sink when she heard a loud crash from the dining room. Heart thumping, she hurried back. See, Dr. Haydock was lying on the floor beside his chair, one hand still clutching the edge of the tablecloth. The plate and the jar of marmalade had fallen with him. A sticky orange smear ran across the carpet. His face was a dreadful greyish purple, and he was not breathing. "Oh, Doctor!" Mrs. Pratt cried. She dropped to her knees, felt for his pulse, and found nothing. With trembling hands, she ran to the telephone in the hall and rang Dr. Giles, the young assistant who had come to help the old man in his later years. Within 20 minutes, Dr. Giles was there, but it was already too late. He knelt beside the body, examined it quickly, and shook his head. "Heart failure," he said quietly. "I'm afraid it was very sudden. He'd been warning me about his own ticker for months. Poor old chap, he went just as he would have wished, out at his own breakfast table." The news spread through St. Mary Mead faster than the morning milk round. By 11 o'clock, everyone in the high street knew. Mrs. Ledbetter, the giver of the marmalade, came hurrying round to Rose Cottage, her face pale and shocked. She stood in the hall twisting her gloves, while Mrs. Pratt told her the sad tale once more. "I only sent it because he always liked my marmalade," Mrs. Ledbetter kept saying. "Who could have thought?" Miss Jane Marple heard the news while she was sitting in her own garden at the end of the village, knitting a soft grey shawl for her nephew's new baby. Her old friend Dolly Bantry, who had walked over for morning coffee, brought the tidings straight from the fishmonger's wife. "Poor Dr. Haydock," Dolly said, helping herself to another biscuit. "They say it was his heart. Just collapsed over his breakfast. Terrible shock for Mrs. Pratt." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily for a moment. Then she said in her gentle old lady voice, The new jar of marmalade, dear." Dolly looked up, surprised. "How on earth did you know about that?" "Oh, one hears things," Miss Marple answered mildly. "Mrs. Pratt mentioned it to the baker's boy, and he told the postman, and the postman told my little maid. It was opened only for the doctor, wasn't it? A kind present from Mrs. Ledbetter." She paused, her blue eyes thoughtful. "Such a pity. He was so fond of marmalade." Dolly laughed. "Jane, you do have the oddest way of looking at things. The poor man dies of a heart attack, and you're worrying about a pot of marmalade." Miss Marple smiled faintly and went on knitting. But inside her neat white-haired head, a small, uncomfortable thought had begun to stir. It was only a tiny thing, hardly worth mentioning, really. Yet it was there, like a small pebble in a comfortable shoe. The jar had been opened only for Dr. Haydock. No one else in the house had touched it. And now the doctor was dead. She pushed the thought away. Natural causes, everyone was saying. And everyone, of course, was probably right. Still, she would just keep her eyes open. One never knew. Whispers over the head. The following afternoon, Miss Marple put on her second-best grey coat and walked slowly down the lane towards the post office. The air was soft and full of the scent of wallflowers, but the village itself felt strangely hushed, as though even the birds were keeping their opinions to themselves. Everyone she passed gave her the same sad little nod and murmured, "Poor Dr. Haydock," before hurrying on their way. Yet behind the sadness, there was already the faintest thread of something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or the first faint stirrings of gossip. At the post office, Miss Marple found Mrs. Ledbetter standing at the counter, buying stamps she did not need. The woman's round, kindly face looked drawn. There were dark circles under her eyes. She turned at once when she saw Miss Marple. "Oh, Miss Marple, I'm so glad to see you. I've hardly slept a wink. That jar of marmalade, it was my own making, you know. I can't stop thinking. What if there was something wrong with the oranges? Or the sugar? Though I used the same recipe I've used for 20 years. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on the other woman's arm. "Now, my dear, you mustn't blame yourself. Dr. Giles said it was his heart. Everyone knew the poor man had been warned." Mrs. Ledbetter gave a shaky sigh. "That's what they keep telling me." Still, the jar was opened only for him. Mrs. Pratt said so herself. No one else in the house had even tasted it. It feels so strange, doesn't it? Before Miss Marple could answer, the door opened again, and in came Mrs. Caroline Cresswell, who lived in the ivy-covered house next to Rose Cottage. She was a tall, a thin woman of about 55, with sharp grey eyes and a mouth that always seemed to be tasting something slightly sour. She and Dr. Haydock had never been the best of friends, though no one could quite say why. She gave the briefest of nods to both ladies. "Terrible business," she said, her voice clipped. "Though I can't say I'm surprised. The doctor had been looking peaky for months, always rushing about at all hours, never taking his own advice. Some people never learn." Mrs. Ledbetter flushed. "He was a good man, Mrs. Cresswell. He sat up with my Arthur for 3 nights running when he had that bad bout of pneumonia in '48. Mrs. Cresswell gave a small, tight smile. "Oh, he was good to some, I dare say. Not to everyone, of course. But we mustn't speak ill of the dead." She bought a packet of peppermints she clearly did not want and left without another word. Miss Marple watched her go, her knitting bag swinging gently from her wrist. She had known Caroline Cresswell for 30 years and had always thought her a rather unhappy woman. There had been a time, long ago, when Mrs. Cresswell's husband, Major Cresswell, had fallen ill with a puzzling fever. Dr. Haydock had treated him for weeks. The Major had recovered, but something had changed between the two men after that. People had whispered about a disagreement over money, or perhaps over the Major's army pension. No one was ever quite sure. Miss Marple had once thought it was nothing more than village tittle-tattle. Now, for the first time, she wondered, she paid for her own small purchases, a reel of white cotton and a tin of barley sugar, and walked home slowly, turning the conversation over in her mind. As she passed the vicarage garden, the Reverend Leonard Clement was clipping his roses. He looked up and smiled. "Miss Marple, just the person I wanted to see. The inquest is tomorrow morning at 11 in the village hall. Dr. Giles has asked me to say a few words at the funeral on Thursday. Such a sad loss. He was a fine doctor." Miss Marple stopped by the low wall. "Indeed he was. Tell me, Mr. Clement, did you happen to know if the doctor had any worries lately? Anything on his mind?" The vicar looked surprised. "Worries? Not that I know of. Though he did say once or twice that some of the old cases still troubled him. You know how conscientious he was. He hated the thought that he might have made a mistake years ago that could still be hurting someone." He shook his head. "But that's the way with all of us, isn't it? We carry our small failures along with us." Miss Marple nodded, but inside her neat head, the little pebble of discomfort had grown just a fraction larger. A mistake from years ago. A jar of marmalade opened only for one man. Mrs. Cresswell's tight little smile. She thanked the vicar and walked on. When she reached her own garden gate, she paused, frowning slightly. For a moment, she had been almost certain that Mrs. Cresswell had been wearing a new pair of gardening gloves. Rather expensive ones for a woman who usually complained about the price of everything. And yet only last week Miss Marple had heard her telling the butcher that she could not afford new curtains. It was a tiny thing, probably nothing at all. Miss Marple chided herself for letting her imagination run away with her. "Really, Jane," she murmured, "you are becoming quite fanciful in your old age." She went inside, made herself a cup of tea, and sat down by the window with her knitting. The grey shawl grew steadily under her fingers, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the breakfast table at Rose Cottage and the sticky orange smear on the carpet. By the time the church clock struck 6, Miss Marple had made up her mind. Tomorrow, after the inquest, she would pay a quiet little call on Mrs. Caroline Cresswell. It would be only neighbourly, after all. She smiled to herself, a small, gentle smile that would have surprised anyone who thought they knew dear old Miss Marple through and through. But then, nobody in St. Mary Mead ever really knew what Miss Marple was thinking. The inquest. The village hall was full by 10:30 the next morning. St. Mary Mead had turned out in force, as it always did when anything out of the ordinary happened. Women in their best hats sat fanning themselves with handkerchiefs. Men in stiff collars coughed and shifted on the wooden chairs. The air smelled of floor polish and mothballs. At the front, on a small raised platform, Dr. Giles sat beside the coroner, a thin, precise man named Mr. Petherick, who had come over from Market Basing. Miss Marple took a seat near the back, next to her old friend Miss Hartnell, who was already whispering loudly about how shocking it all was. "Poor man," Miss Hartnell kept saying. "And in his own dining room too. One never knows, does one?" The proceedings were short and very proper. Dr. Giles gave his evidence in a quiet, as professional voice. Death, he said, had been due to sudden heart failure. There were no signs of poison or violence. The marmalade jar had been sent to the county laboratory as a matter of routine, but the report had come back quite clear. Nothing wrong with it. Mrs. Pratt and Mrs. Ledbetter both spoke, their voices trembling a little. Mrs. Cresswell was not called. The coroner summed up in 5 minutes. In the absence of any evidence to the contrary, he said, "I am satisfied that the deceased died from natural causes. We offer our sincere sympathy to his friends and to the village he served so long." There was a small murmur of agreement. A verdict of death from natural causes was duly recorded. People began to rise, collecting their gloves and handbags. Miss Marple remained seated for a moment, her hands folded neatly in her lap, and she had expected nothing else, and yet the jar had been opened only for the doctor. That small fact still sat in her mind like a single dropped stitch in an otherwise perfect piece of knitting. Outside in the sunshine, the crowd broke into little groups. Miss Marple saw Mrs. Cresswell standing a little apart, talking to the butcher's wife. She looked neither pleased nor sorry, merely watchful, as though waiting for something. Miss Marple straightened her hat, picked up her knitting bag, and walked across the grass. "Good morning, Mrs. Cresswell," she said pleasantly. "Such a sad business, is it not? I was wondering whether I might call on you for a few minutes. I have some of that nice damson jam left from last summer, and I thought you might like a pot." Mrs. Cresswell looked surprised, but she gave her usual tight little smile. "Ah, that is very kind of you, Miss Marple. Do come along. I was just going home." They walked together up the lane, past the church and the row of cottages with their bright front gardens. Mrs. Cresswell's house, Ivy Lodge, was neat and rather dark inside, the windows half covered by heavy curtains. She led the way into the sitting room and offered Miss Marple a chair by the empty fireplace. "I'll make some tea," she said. "It won't take a minute." While she was gone, Miss Marple let her eyes wander. Everything was in its proper place. The polished brass candlesticks, the photograph of the late Major Cresswell in uniform, the small silver tray with visiting cards. On the mantelpiece stood a framed certificate from the Royal Army Medical Corps, dated 1917. Miss Marple had seen it many times before, but had never looked at the name underneath, and now she leaned forward. It was signed by Captain E. Haydock. How strange, she thought. She had quite forgotten that Dr. Haydock had once served in the same regiment as the Major. She was still frowning over this small discovery when Mrs. Cresswell returned with the tray. "I see you're looking at that old certificate," Mrs. Cresswell said, setting the tea things down rather sharply. "My husband thought the world of Dr. Haydock in those days. They were great friends once." "Once?" Miss Marple repeated gently, accepting her cup. Mrs. Cresswell sat down opposite her. For a moment, her face hardened. "People change, Miss Marple, or perhaps they don't. Perhaps we simply see them more clearly as the years go by." She stirred her tea with quick, angry little movements. "The doctor made a mistake, you know, a long time ago. My husband's illness in 1937, the fever that nearly killed him. Dr. Haydock insisted it was malaria. He gave him the wrong treatment for weeks. If it hadn't been for another doctor who happened to be visiting, Arthur would have died. The mistake was hushed up, of course. Doctors look after their own, but I never forgot. And neither did my husband." Miss Marple's blue eyes were very innocent. "How dreadful for you both," she murmured. "But the Major recovered in the end, did he not?" "Oh, yes, he recovered." Mrs. Cresswell gave a short, bitter laugh. "He lived another 12 years. Long enough to hear Dr. Haydock praised to the skies every time someone had a cold or a sprained ankle. Long enough to watch the doctor walk about this village as if he had never done a wrong thing in his life. It rankled, Miss Marple. It rankled very deeply." She stopped suddenly. as though she had said more than she meant. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked loudly in the quiet room. Miss Marple took another sip of tea. She had come expecting to find a jealous neighbour, and instead she had found something sharper, a long-nursed grievance. For a moment, she felt almost sorry for the woman. Then she remembered the sticky orange smear on the carpet at Rose Cottage and the small pop of the marmalade jar lid. Sympathy faded. "I do understand," she said softly. "Grudges can grow very large when they are kept in the dark, can't they?" Mrs. Cresswell looked at her sharply. "What exactly do you mean by that, Miss Marple?" "Oh, nothing at all," Miss Marple replied, smiling in her mildest way. "I was only thinking aloud. One does at my age. Thank you so much for the tea. My dear, I really must be going." She rose, picked up her bag, and was halfway to the door when she paused. "By the way," she added, almost as an afterthought, "I believe I have muddled up the dates again. Was it not 1938 when the Major was ill? I seem to remember it was the year after the big flood." Mrs. Cresswell's face went very still. "No," she said coldly. "It was 1937. I'm quite certain." Miss Marple nodded, apologized again for her poor memory, and left. But as she walked down the garden path, she felt a small, quiet satisfaction. She had made a deliberate little mistake, and Mrs. Cresswell had corrected her at once. People who told the truth rarely cared about exact years. People who were hiding something almost always did. The sun was warm on her back as she turned towards home. The inquest was over, and the village had accepted the verdict. But Miss Marple knew, with the quiet certainty that had solved so many small puzzles in St. Mary Mead, that the marmalade pot had not finished telling its story. Not yet. Tea and tangled threads. Miss Marple walked home slowly, the afternoon sun warm on her shoulders. The lane was quiet except for the distant clop of the baker's pony cart and the soft rustle of leaves in the hedgerows. She turned the conversation with Mrs. Cresswell over in her mind like a piece of knitting that refused to lie flat. The woman's bitterness had been real enough, yet something about it felt practiced, as though the words had been repeated many times in the quiet hours of the night. A grudge nursed for 16 years was a heavy thing to carry. Heavy enough, perhaps, to make a person do the unthinkable. She gave herself a little shake. "Really, Jane," she murmured aloud, "you are letting your fancy run away with you again. The coroner was quite clear, natural causes." Still, the small pebble of doubt refused to be shaken off. When she reached her own cottage, she found young Cherry Baker, her little maid, waiting at the garden gate with a message. "Mrs. Pratt telephoned, miss," Cherry said, bobbing a quick curtsy. "She asked if you would be so kind as to call round to Rose Cottage this evening. She's in a proper state, she is. Says there's something she can't get out of her head, and she won't speak to anyone else." Miss Marple's blue eyes sharpened. "Did she say what it was about, Cherry?" "No, miss. Only that it was to do with the breakfast things, and she didn't want to trouble Dr. Giles again." Miss Marple thanked the girl and went inside. She changed into her indoor shoes, made herself a fresh pot of tea, and sat for 20 minutes with her knitting. The grey shawl was growing nicely, but her thoughts kept drifting to Rose Cottage and the sticky orange smear on the dining room carpet. At 4:30, she put on her hat once more and set out. Mrs. Pratt met her at the door of Rose Cottage. The housekeeper's face was blotchy with recent tears, and she kept twisting a damp handkerchief between her hands. "Oh, Miss Marple, I'm that glad you've come," she burst out. "I've been going over and over it in my mind. till I don't know whether I'm standing on my head or my heels. Come into the kitchen, do. I've just made a fresh pot." They sat at the scrubbed deal table. Mrs. Pratt poured tea with a hand that trembled slightly. "It's the marmalade jar, miss," she said without preamble. "After the doctor, after it happened, I cleared everything away like I always do. I washed the plate and the knife and put the jar in the larder. I thought it might come in useful for something. But this morning, when I went to fetch it, the jar was gone." Miss Marple set her cup down very carefully. "Gone? Clean gone, miss. The shelf was empty. I've turned the whole kitchen upside down. I even looked in the dustbin, though the dustman came yesterday. It's vanished, and I can't help thinking, who would take an almost full jar of marmalade? It doesn't make sense." Miss Marple was silent for a moment. Then she asked gently, "Had anyone else been in the house since the doctor's death, Mrs. Pratt?" "Only the usual people. Dr. Giles came to sign the papers. Mrs. Ledbetter called twice to see if I was all right. And Mrs. Cresswell popped in yesterday afternoon with a rice pudding she said I might like. She was ever so kind, stayed and helped me polish the brass for 10 minutes. Said it would take my mind off things." Mrs. Cresswell again. Miss Marple felt a small flicker of excitement, quickly suppressed. She must not jump to conclusions. That was how mistakes were made. She had made one only that morning with the dates. She must be careful. "Tell me, Mrs. Pratt," she said, "did the doctor ever speak to you about anything that was worrying him lately? Anything from the past, perhaps?" The housekeeper frowned, thinking, "Well, he did say something odd a few weeks ago. We were clearing out some old papers together." He pulled out a faded letter and stared at it for a long time. "Pratt," he said, "if ever a man wishes he could turn back the clock, it's when he remembers a mistake that can't be put right." I asked him what he meant, but he only smiled that tired smile of his and put the letter away. I never saw it again. Miss Marple nodded slowly. A mistake that couldn't be put right. The same phrase the vicar had used. It was beginning to feel as though half the village knew there had been some old shadow over Dr. Haydock's life, yet no one would speak of it plainly. She finished her tea, thanked Mrs. Pratt warmly, and promised to think about the missing jar. As she walked home, the church clock struck 6. The evening light was soft and golden, turning the cottage gardens into pictures from a storybook. But Miss Marple's mind was not on the roses or the hollyhocks. She had reached the corner by the vicarage when she saw Mrs. Cresswell coming towards her, carrying a basket of early spinach. The woman stopped when she saw Miss Marple. "Still out paying calls? I'm Miss Marple," she asked, her voice light but her eyes watchful. "Oh, just a little walk," Miss Marple replied mildly. "The evenings are so pleasant now. I was sorry to hear about the marmalade jar disappearing from Rose Cottage. Such an odd thing." Mrs. Cresswell's basket tilted slightly. A few leaves of spinach fluttered to the ground. "Disappearing? I hadn't heard. How very strange. Though I suppose in all the upset no one was minding things properly." She bent to pick up the spinach, and when she straightened, her face was perfectly calm again. "If you'll excuse me, I must get on. The hens won't wait for their supper." She walked away briskly. Miss Marple watched her go, a small frown between her white eyebrows. She was almost certain that Mrs. Cresswell's hand had trembled as she picked up the spinach. Almost certain, but not quite. At her age, one's eyes were not what they used to be. She had mistaken the year of the Major's illness that very morning. She must not let herself make another mistake so soon. Yet, as she turned into her own gate, she could not quite banish the picture of Mrs. Cresswell's face when the missing jar had been mentioned. It had looked for just a second like the face of a woman who had heard exactly what she had been expecting to hear. Miss Marple went inside, closed the door softly, and sat down by the window with her knitting. The grey shawl grew under her fingers, row after steady row. But her thoughts were far away, turning and turning around a jar of golden marmalade that had vanished as neatly as though it had never been. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, she felt sure, someone was very carefully hiding the last piece of the puzzle, and Miss Marple meant to find it, the faded letter. The next morning, Miss Marple was sitting in her little drawing room, the grey shawl spread across her lap, when the telephone rang. It was Dr. Giles, sounding rather harassed. "Miss Marple, I wonder if you could spare me a few minutes this morning. I'm at the surgery clearing out poor Dr. Haydock's desk, and I've come across something rather puzzling. I'd rather not discuss it over the telephone if you don't mind." Miss Marple felt that small, familiar thrill she always tried to pretend she did not feel. "Of course, my dear. I shall be with you directly." She put on her coat, picked up her knitting bag, and walked the short distance to the surgery at the end of the high street. The brass plate still read Dr. E. Haydock, though someone had already begun to polish it a little less brightly. "Doctor," and Giles met her at the door himself, and led her into the small back room that had served as the old doctor's private study for 30 years. Papers were stacked on the desk in neat piles. A half-empty bottle of ink stood beside a faded green blotter. Dr. Giles picked up a single sheet of notepaper and handed it to her. "I found this tucked right at the back of the bottom drawer. It's dated 1937. I thought perhaps you might remember something about it." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and read the short letter in silence. It was written in a firm, educated hand. "My dear Haydock, I have thought long and hard about the events of last month. Your diagnosis was wrong, dangerously so, and only the mercy of Providence and Dr. Larrabee's prompt intervention saved my life. I do not intend to make trouble for you in the village, but I must ask you never to treat me or my family again. The matter is closed between us. Yours sincerely, Major Arthur Cresswell." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and handed it back. "So, the quarrel was more serious than people guessed," she said quietly. Dr. Giles ran a hand through his fair hair. "I had no idea. Dr. Haydock never spoke of it. But look at the date. 1937. That was the year of the big malaria scare after the floods. Everyone thought the Major had picked it up on one of his old army postings. Dr. Haydock treated him for weeks. Then Dr. Larrabee, who was only visiting from London, realized it was actually a rare blood disorder. If he hadn't stepped in, he shrugged. The Major recovered, but it seems he never forgave the mistake." Miss Marple nodded slowly. She remembered the year perfectly well now. It had been the same summer her nephew Raymond had come down with chicken pox, and she had spent 3 weeks nursing him. But for a moment, just a moment, she had almost said 1938 aloud again. The same foolish slip she had made with Mrs. Cresswell. She caught herself in time and felt a small flush of annoyance at her own wandering memory. Really, at her age, one ought to be more careful. She asked gently, "Did Dr. Haydock ever mention this to you, Doctor?" "Never, but there was something else." Dr. Giles opened the top drawer and took out a small, worn notebook. This was with the letter. It's his private case notes from that year. On the last page, he had written, "Cresswell, error in diagnosis. Patient nearly lost. Must live with this. and then, much later, in different ink, still living with it. Ah, God forgive me." Miss Marple was silent. The room felt very quiet except for the ticking of the old wall clock. A long-buried mistake. A grudge that had grown in the dark like a weed in an untended garden. And now the doctor was dead, after eating from a jar of marmalade that had been opened only for him. She said, "The marmalade jar that disappeared from Rose Cottage. Have you heard anything more about that?" Dr. Giles looked startled. "Mrs. Pratt mentioned it to me yesterday. I thought it was just one of those odd things that happen when people are upset. You don't think—" "I don't know what to think yet," Miss Marple answered honestly. "But I do wonder whether someone wanted to make quite certain that no one else would ever taste that particular marmalade." She rose to go, then paused at the door. "Tell me, Dr. Giles, did Mrs. Cresswell ever come to the surgery after her husband's illness?" "Once or twice in the early days, I believe. She collected some tablets for the Major, but after that, nothing. They changed to Dr. Larrabee whenever they needed a doctor, even though it meant going all the way to Market Basing." Miss Marple thanked him and walked home through the morning sunshine. The village looked as peaceful as ever. The butcher's boy whistling on his bicycle, old Mr. Petherick clipping his hedge, the postman chatting with the vicar's wife. Yet underneath the calm, Miss Marple could feel the threads tightening. She had made a tiny slip about the date again. Nothing important, but it reminded her that even she could be wrong. The thought steadied her. One must never be too sure. As she turned into her own gate, she saw Mrs. Ledbetter coming down the lane. He's looking rather flushed and carrying a covered basket. "Miss Marple, I was just coming to see you. I've brought some of my lemon curd. I know how you like it. And, well, there's something I feel I ought to tell you. It's been worrying me ever since the inquest." Miss Marple opened the gate wider. "Do come in, my dear. We'll have a cup of coffee, and you can tell me all about it." They settled in the sunny kitchen. Mrs. Ledbetter twisted her gloves in her lap. "It's about the marmalade," she said at last. "The jar I sent to the doctor. I made two exactly the same, you see. One for him and one for myself. I always do that, but yesterday, when I went to open my own jar for breakfast, there was a tiny hole in the wax seal under the lid. Just a pinprick. I thought at first it was nothing. Hey, but now I keep wondering, suppose someone had tampered with both jars? Suppose someone wanted the doctor to die and didn't care if I did too?" Miss Marple's needles stopped clicking. For the first time, the little pebble of doubt felt more like a stone. She reached out and patted Mrs. Ledbetter's hand. "Now, my dear, you mustn't let your imagination run away with you. But I think perhaps we should mention this to someone. Quietly, of course." Yet even as she spoke, Miss Marple's mind was already turning to Ivy Lodge, and the woman who had carried a rice pudding to Mrs. Pratt the very day the jar disappeared. A woman who had corrected a date with cold certainty. A woman who had once watched her husband nearly die because of a doctor's mistake. The grudge had been hidden for 16 years, and perhaps it had finally found its way into a pot of golden marmalade. Miss Marple smiled gently at her visitor and poured more coffee. But inside her neat white head, the knitting needles of thought were working faster than ever. The pinprick in the wax. That same afternoon, Miss Marple put on her gardening gloves and went out to her front border, ostensibly to deadhead the early roses. In truth, she wanted time to think. The lemon curd from Mrs. Ledbetter sat untouched on the kitchen table. The story of the pinprick in the wax seal had left a cold little feeling in her chest. 2 identical jars. One for the doctor, one for the giver herself. And now 1 jar missing and the other tampered with. It was too neat to be chance. She was still snipping faded blooms when she saw old Mr. Abbott, the village chemist, walking past with his little black bag. He had been in St. Mary Mead almost as long as Dr. Haydock himself. Miss Marple straightened up and called to him in her mildest voice. "Good afternoon, Mr. Abbott. Such lovely weather, is it not? And I wonder if you could spare me a moment. I seem to have run out of my usual sleeping tablets, and my old prescription has quite expired." Mr. Abbott, a small, fussy man with steel-rimmed spectacles, stopped at the gate. "Of course, Miss Marple. I'll pop round this evening if you like, though I must say Dr. Giles has been rather strict about repeating prescriptions since the sad business at Rose Cottage." Miss Marple smiled apologetically. "I quite understand, but while you're here, perhaps you could tell me something. I have been worrying about poor Mrs. Ledbetter. She mentioned that the wax seal on her marmalade jar had a tiny hole in it. I wondered whether anyone in the village had been asking for, anything that might make such a hole. A fine needle, or a hypodermic perhaps." Mr. Abbott's eyebrows rose. "A hole in the wax? That sounds very odd indeed. I've had no such requests. People mostly want cough mixture or liver salts these days, though now you mention it." He lowered his voice and glanced up and down the empty lane. "Mrs. Cresswell did come in last week for a bottle of her usual tonic. She seemed rather agitated. Asked if I had anything stronger for nerves. I told her the tonic was quite sufficient, but she kept staring at the shelves behind me as though looking for something else. I thought nothing of it at the time." Miss Marple's needles of thought clicked faster. "How very interesting," she murmured. "And did she buy anything besides the tonic?" "Only a tin of rat poison," Mr. Abbott said, almost apologetically. "She said the mice were getting into her store cupboard again. Perfectly ordinary request. I wrapped it up myself and warned her to keep it well away from the food, as I always do." Rat poison. Miss Marple felt the small stone of doubt grow heavier. She thanked Mr. Abbott warmly, promised to call at the shop the next morning for her tablets, and went back to her roses. But her hands were no longer steady. She had made a foolish little mistake only yesterday, confusing the year of the Major's illness again in her own mind. And now she wondered whether she was making another. Rat poison was common enough in every village household. To connect it with marmalade was perhaps too fanciful. Still, the picture would not leave her. Mrs. Cresswell standing in the chemist's shop, her eyes moving along the shelves, her hand reaching for the familiar brown bottle with the skull and crossbones on the label. Miss Marple went indoors. He washed her hands and sat down at the little writing table by the window. She took out a sheet of notepaper and began to make a short list in her neat, old-fashioned hand. Major Cresswell's illness, 1937. Wrong diagnosis by Dr. Haydock. Letter found in doctor's desk. Unforgiven mistake. Marmalade jar opened only for the doctor, now missing. Mrs. Ledbetter's identical jar. Pinprick in wax seal. Mrs. Cresswell buys rat poison 1 week before the death. She looked at the list for a long time. Then, with a small sigh, she added in brackets beside, "Possibly nothing at all. Many people keep rat poison." She folded the paper and slipped it into her knitting bag. It was time, she decided, to have another quiet word with Mrs. Pratt. The housekeeper might remember whether Mrs. Cresswell had been alone in the kitchen on the day she brought the rice pudding. The evening was still light when Miss Marple set out once more. Rose Cottage looked much as it always had, except that the blinds were half drawn and the brass knocker had not been polished. Mrs. Pratt opened the door at once, looking relieved to see her. "I was hoping you'd come, miss," she said. "I've remembered something else. When Mrs. Cresswell was here helping me with the brass, she asked to use the lavatory. I thought nothing of it at the time, but later I noticed the back door to the kitchen had been left unbolted. I always bolt it after the milkman's gone. I'm sure I bolted it that morning." Miss Marple's blue eyes were very gentle. "And the larder is just beside the back door, is it not?" "Yes, miss, right next to it." The two women looked at each other in the quiet hallway. Neither needed to say the words aloud. The missing jar could have been taken in 30 seconds. A quick reach, a handkerchief to avoid fingerprints perhaps, and the jar would be gone. Miss Marple laid a hand on Mrs. Pratt's arm. "You have been very helpful, my dear, but we must be careful. These are only little thoughts after all, nothing that would stand up in a court of law." She walked home slowly as the church clock struck 8. The lane was full of the scent of night stock and the distant lowing of cows being brought in for milking. Everything was exactly as it should be in St. Mary Mead. Yet Miss Marple could not shake the feeling that somewhere behind one of those neatly curtained windows, a long-hidden grudge had finally found its weapon. And that weapon had been no bigger than a pinprick in a wax seal. She paused at her own gate and looked back towards Ivy Lodge, where a single light burned in an upstairs window. Mrs. Cresswell was at home. For the first time, Miss Marple wondered whether she herself had been wrong about the woman's character all these years. She had always thought Mrs. Cresswell merely sharp-tongued and rather unhappy. Now she was beginning to see something colder, something that had waited 16 years. She went inside, closed the door, and sat down with her knitting. The grey shawl grew steadily under her fingers, row after careful row. But her mind was far away, and turning over the small facts like so many stitches that refused to lie flat. One mistake, long ago, in a sick room. One jar of marmalade. One pinprick in the wax. Miss Marple sighed softly. She had been wrong about the date once already. She hoped, most sincerely, that she was not wrong now. The quiet conversation. The following morning, Miss Marple attended the 11 o'clock service at St. Mary Mead Church, as she had done every Sunday for more years than she cared to count. The vicar's sermon was gentle and rather vague, full of comfort for those who had lost a dear friend. Miss Marple sat in her usual pew, her hands folded over her prayer book, but her mind was not entirely on the service. She kept seeing the single light burning late at Ivy Lodge and the small brown bottle of rat poison on Mr. Abbott's shelf. After the benediction, she lingered in the porch while the rest of the congregation drifted away. The Reverend Leonard Clement found her there, putting on her gloves with slow, deliberate movements. "Miss Marple," he said warmly, "how nice to see you. Would you care to come back to the vicarage for a cup of coffee? My wife has made some of her excellent shortbread." Miss Marple accepted with a smile. "That would be very pleasant, Mr. Clement. I have been feeling rather unsettled since poor Dr. Haydock's passing. A little talk might do me good." They walked together across the churchyard. The vicarage garden was bright with daffodils and the first wallflowers, and Mrs. Clement greeted them at the door with her usual cheerful bustle. Soon they were settled in the sunny morning room, with coffee and shortbread on a tray. The vicar cleared his throat. "I understand you've been asking a few quiet questions about the doctor, Miss Marple. The whole village is still in shock, of course. Such a sudden end. Miss Marple took a small sip of coffee. Yes, it was sudden. And yet, one cannot help wondering about that marmalade jar. It disappeared so strangely, did it not? Mrs. Clement looked up sharply. Disappeared? I hadn't heard that part. How very peculiar. The vicar nodded. Mrs. Pratt mentioned it to me yesterday, after evensong. She seemed quite distressed. I told her it was probably just misplaced in all the confusion, but she was quite certain. Miss Marple set her cup down. There is something else, Mr. Clement. Something from many years ago. I believe you once told me that Dr. Whodunit had spoken of an old mistake that still troubled him. The vicar hesitated, then sighed. He did. Only once, and very briefly. It was after evensong last autumn. We were walking back together and he said quite suddenly, Len, if a doctor makes a mistake, it can lie in the ground like a seed. And sometimes that seed grows. I asked him what he meant, but he only shook his head and changed the subject. I always assumed it was some old case from the war years. Miss Marple was silent for a moment. She had meant to ask a careful question about the Cresswells, but the words that came out were not quite what she had planned. Was it perhaps something to do with Major Cresswell's illness in 1938? The vicar looked surprised. 1938? No, I'm almost certain it was the summer of 37, the year of the big floods. My predecessor was still here then, and he mentioned it in one of his letters. The Major was very ill indeed. Miss Marple felt a small flush of embarrassment. There it was again, that silly slip with the date. She had corrected herself in her own mind only yesterday, and yet here she was making the same mistake aloud. Really, she thought crossly, one would think her memory was as unreliable as old Mrs. Black's. She smiled apologetically. How foolish of me. Of course it was 1937. My nephew Raymond always says I get the years muddled when I am thinking of too many things at once. The vicar smiled kindly. It happens to the best of us. But yes, I believe the trouble was in 37. Dr. Whodunit blamed himself rather bitterly, though no one else ever knew the details. The Major recovered, thank heaven, but I think the friendship between the two men never quite mended. Miss Marple nodded. The coffee had grown a little cool, but she finished it anyway. She had come hoping for one small new thread, and instead she had been given confirmation of what she already half suspected. A seed planted in 1937. A grudge watered for 16 long years. And now, perhaps, that seed had borne bitter fruit in a pot of homemade marmalade. She rose to leave, thanking the Clements for their kindness. As she reached the garden gate, Mrs. Clement called after her, Miss Marple, if there is anything worrying you, you will tell us, won't you? We are all rather fond of you, you know. Miss Marple turned with her gentlest smile. How very kind, but I am only an old woman with too much time for fancies. Nothing to trouble anyone about. She walked home slowly, the church bells ringing out the end of the morning. The lane was peaceful, yet she could not shake the feeling that someone was watching her from behind the curtains of Ivy Lodge. She paused once to tie her shoe, using the moment to glance back. The upstairs window was empty, but the lace curtain had moved just a fraction. Inside her own cottage, she sat down at once and took out the little list she had made the day before. She crossed out the bracketed note beside the rat poison and wrote instead, in her neat hand, Mrs. Cresswell, opportunity and motive. Then she added one more line at the bottom. Must be quite sure before I speak. No more mistakes with dates or anything else. She put the paper away and picked up her knitting. The grey shawl was nearly finished now. Only a few more rows, and it would be ready for her nephew's baby. The steady click of the needles calmed her, but her thoughts kept returning to the same picture. Mrs. Cresswell in the kitchen at Rose Cottage, alone for a moment, reaching quickly toward the larder shelf. Miss Marple sighed. She had been wrong about the year twice now. She hoped with all her heart that she was not wrong about the marmalade. Yet, even as the thought formed, a small, quiet voice inside her, the voice that had solved so many village puzzles, whispered that this time she was almost certainly right. And that, in its own way, was the most worrying thing of all. The light in the upstairs window. Miss Marple spent the rest of that Sunday afternoon in her garden, deadheading the last of the daffodils with small, precise snips of her secateurs. The air was soft and warm, full of the scent of wallflowers and new-mown grass from the vicarage lawn, but her thoughts were anything but peaceful. The list in her knitting bag seemed to grow heavier with every hour. She had added one more line before church that morning. Must speak to Mrs. Cresswell again, but carefully. No more foolish mistakes. She had already made the date slip twice now, once to Mrs. Cresswell herself and once to the vicar. It was embarrassing and more than a little worrying. At her age, one expected the memory to play the occasional trick, but not on something so important. She chided herself sternly as she carried the basket of faded blooms to the compost heap. Really, Jane, you are becoming quite unreliable. Next thing you know, you will be forgetting your own name. Yet the picture of that single light burning late at Ivy Lodge would not leave her. At 5:30, she changed into her second-best grey coat, picked up a small pot of her own damson jam as a pretext, and set out once more down the lane. Ivy Lodge looked exactly as it always had. Neat, a little dark, the ivy clipped back from the windows with military precision. Miss Marple noticed, however, that the front step had been freshly scrubbed, and that the brass knocker gleamed more brightly than usual. Someone had been keeping busy. Mrs. Cresswell opened the door herself. She wore a dark dress with a high collar, and her hair was drawn back so tightly it gave her face a sharp, almost bird-like look. She did not smile. "Miss Marple, what a surprise! I was just about to sit down to my supper." "I shan't keep you long, my dear," Miss Marple said in her gentlest voice. "I only wanted to bring you this little pot of damson jam. I know how fond you are of it, and I thought, after all the upset of the last few days, well, a little something homemade is sometimes a comfort." Mrs. Cresswell took the jar without looking at it. "That is very kind. Won't you come in for a moment?" The sitting room was as tidy as ever, but the photograph of Major Cresswell seemed to have been dusted with extra care. Miss Marple sat in the same chair she had occupied on her previous visit. Mrs. Cresswell did not offer tea this time, as she remained standing by the mantelpiece, one hand resting on the cold marble. "If you have come to ask more questions about Dr. Haydock," she said abruptly, "I have nothing further to say. The inquest is over. The verdict was natural causes. That should be enough for anyone." Miss Marple smoothed her gloves in her lap. "Oh, quite enough for most people, I agree. And yet, one cannot help wondering about that marmalade jar that disappeared from Rose Cottage. Such an odd thing to vanish, don't you think?" Mrs. Cresswell's fingers tightened on the edge of the mantelpiece. "I really have no idea. I took Mrs. Pratt a rice pudding, that is all. I helped her polish a few brass ornaments. I did not go near the larder." Miss Marple nodded, her blue eyes very innocent. "Of course not, though Our abbot at the chemist's shop mentioned you had bought some rat poison only a week or so earlier. For the mice, I believe he said." There was a small, sharp silence. Mrs. Cresswell's face did not change, but a faint flush crept up her neck. "Rat poison is perfectly ordinary," she said coldly. "Half the houses in the village keep it. The mice have been dreadful this spring." "Indeed they have," Miss Marple agreed. "Mrs. Ledbetter told me the very same thing only yesterday. She found a tiny hole in the wax seal of her own jar of marmalade, the one she had made at the same time as the doctor's. A pinprick, she called it. So strange, isn't it?" For the first time, Mrs. Cresswell's composure cracked. Her hand left the mantelpiece, and she took one step forward. "What exactly are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" "Oh, nothing at all, my dear. I am only an old woman who notices things, small things, like the way you corrected me so quickly about the year of the Major's illness. Most people would not have been so certain after 16 years. But then some memories stay very clear, don't they?" Mrs. Cresswell gave a short, bitter laugh. "You think I poisoned the doctor because of something that happened in 1937? How ridiculous! The man was 72. His heart was weak. Everyone knew that." Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. She was thinking of the faded letter in Dr. Haydock's desk and the words "God forgive me" written in a different ink years later. She was also thinking that she herself had nearly said 1938 again just now, and only caught the mistake at the last second. Another foolish slip. It made her cheeks feel warm. She rose slowly. I am sorry if I have distressed you. I only thought, if there was anything you wished to tell me, in confidence, well, I have lived in St. Mary Mead a very long time. I have seen grudges come and go. Sometimes it is better to speak before they grow too large." Mrs. Cresswell walked her to the door in silence. As Miss Marple stepped out onto the path, the other woman spoke again very low. "You are wrong, Miss Marple, quite wrong. I did not kill Dr. Haydock, but I will tell you this, I am not sorry he is dead. He took 16 years of my husband's peace of mind, and he never paid for it, not once. Now, if you will excuse me, my supper is getting cold." The door closed with a firm click. Miss Marple walked home through the soft evening light. The church clock struck 7 as she reached her own gate. She felt strangely unsettled. Mrs. Cresswell had not denied buying the rat poison. She had not denied the grudge. Yet she had denied the murder with such flat certainty that for a moment, just a moment, Miss Marple wondered whether she herself had been mistaken after all. Perhaps the pinprick was nothing. Perhaps the missing jar really had been misplaced. Perhaps her own memory really was failing, and she was seeing shadows where there were none. She went inside, closed the door, and sat down heavily in her armchair. The grey shawl lay folded on the table beside her, finished and perfect. She picked it up and ran her fingers over the soft wool. One small mistake with a date. One small doubt in her own mind. And yet the light had been burning late again at Ivy Lodge when she glanced back from the corner of the lane. Miss Marple sighed, switched on the standard lamp, and reached for her knitting bag. There were still a few rows left on a new pair of socks for the vicar's nephew. The needles clicked steadily in the quiet room, but her thoughts were far from wool and patterns. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, the last piece of the puzzle was still hidden, and Miss Marple, for the first time in many years, was no longer quite sure she knew where to look for it, the shadow under the apple tree. Monday morning dawned grey and soft, with a thin mist hanging over the village gardens. Miss Marple had slept badly, her mind turning over the same small facts like a child worrying a loose tooth. Mrs. Cresswell's flat denial, the moved curtain at the upstairs window, the rat poison, the pinprick, they refused to settle into any neat pattern. She had been so sure yesterday evening, and yet by the time the church clock struck midnight, she had begun to doubt herself again. Perhaps the grudge had been nothing more than bitter words after all. Perhaps the marmalade really had been nothing but a jar of homemade preserve. And the doctor's heart had simply given out, as Dr. Giles had said. She was still in her dressing gown, drinking her second cup of tea at the kitchen table, when young Cherry Baker came in with the Morning Post and a piece of news. "Miss, you'll never guess," Cherry said, eyes bright. "They've found that missing marmalade jar, or at least a part of it. Old Mr. Ted from the allotments was digging his potato patch this morning and turned up a broken glass jar, wrapped in a bit of sacking. Sticky orange stuff still inside. He brought it straight to the police station, but Sergeant Cobb said it was probably just rubbish. Still, Mrs. Pratt went down to look, and she swears it's the same one. The label's half torn, but she remembers the handwriting." Miss Marple set her cup down with a small click. "Where exactly was it found, Cherry?" "Under the hedge at the bottom of Ivy Lodge Garden, miss. Right where the apple tree overhangs the allotments. Funny place for a jar to end up, isn't it?" Miss Marple felt the old familiar thrill sharp and clear this time. She thanked Cherry, finished her tea quickly, and dressed with more care than usual. 20 minutes later, she was walking down the lane towards the allotments, her knitting bag over her arm, and a basket of early lettuces on the other, as though she were merely taking a neighbourly gift to old Mr. Ted. The broken jar was no longer there. Sergeant Cobb had taken it away just to be on the safe side, he said, but the patch of disturbed earth was easy to see. Miss Marple stood for a long moment under the apple tree, looking up at the back windows of Ivy Lodge. The hedge was thick, but not so thick that a jar could not have been pushed through on a dark night. A quick throw from an upstairs window, perhaps, and the sacking to muffle the sound. It was almost too simple. She was still standing there when the back gate of Ivy Lodge opened, and Mrs. Cresswell came down the path, carrying a trug of garden rubbish. She stopped when she saw Miss Marple. "Looking for something, Miss Marple?" Her voice was polite, but there was an edge to it like a knife wrapped in silk. "Oh, only admiring your apple tree," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Such beautiful blossom this year. I was just bringing Mr. Ted a few lettuces and thought I would take the shortcut." She paused, then added, as though it had only just occurred to her, "I hear they found a broken jar near here. How very strange." Mrs. Cresswell's knuckles whitened on the handle of the trug. "Children, I expect. Always throwing things over hedges. Or perhaps one of the village boys playing silly tricks after the inquest. Perhaps," Miss Marple said. She hesitated, then made the small deliberate mistake she had planned. "Though I suppose it couldn't have anything to do with that business in 1938, could it? The Major's illness, I mean. My memory really is getting quite dreadful these days." Mrs. Cresswell's eyes narrowed. "It was 1937, she said at once, the words coming out sharp and quick. "I have told you that before. Some people never listen." Miss Marple gave a little apologetic smile. "Of course, how silly of me. 1937, the year of the floods. I really must write these things down, or I shall forget my own birthday next." She bent to pick up a fallen apple blossom from the grass, using the moment to hide the small flush of satisfaction on her cheeks. The trap had worked again, twice now, Mrs. Cresswell had corrected the date without a second's hesitation. Innocent people did not guard old years so jealously. She straightened up. "Well, I mustn't keep you. Good morning, my dear." She walked on to Mr. Ted's allotment, left the lettuces, and chatted for 5 minutes about the weather and the price of seed potatoes. When she turned back towards the lane, she saw that Mrs. Cresswell was still standing by the hedge, watching her. The trug had been set down, and both hands were clasped tightly in front of her. Miss Marple went home slowly, the mist now lifting to show a pale blue sky. She felt no triumph, only a quiet sadness. The pieces were almost all in place. The old mistake, the long grudge, the rat poison, the missing jar thrown away in panic. Yet one small thing still nagged at her. The pinprick in Mrs. Ledbetter's own jar. If Mrs. Cresswell had wanted only the doctor dead, why risk 2 jars? Unless the second hole had been a mistake, or a hasty attempt to make it look like an accident that had gone wrong. She sat down at her writing table and took out the little list once more. She crossed out the last line she had written, and added instead in her neat, careful hand, "Speak to Dr. Giles, today, before anyone else does anything foolish." She sealed the list in an envelope and slipped it into her bag. Then she put on her hat, picked up her knitting, and walked to the surgery. Dr. Giles was between patients and received her at once in the little back room. Miss Marple came straight to the point. "Doctor, I believe I know why Dr. Haydock died. It was not his heart, it was the marmalade. And I believe I know who put the poison in it. But before I say anything to Sergeant Cobb, I should like your opinion on one small medical point." She told him everything, quietly, fact by fact, leaving out only her own foolish slips with the dates. When she had finished, Dr. Giles sat very still, his young face grave. "It fits," he said at last. "The symptoms could match certain vegetable alkaloids, delayed but deadly. And if the poison was mixed in the marmalade while it was still warm from the pan." He shook his head. "But Miss Marple, this is a very serious accusation. We must be quite sure." "I am sure," Miss Marple said gently. "Though I have been wrong about 1 or 2 small things lately. My memory is not what it was." She gave a small, self-deprecating smile. "Still, I think this time the facts are clear enough." "Doctor," and Giles looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached for the telephone. "I'll ask Sergeant Cobb to come round quietly. And I think, Miss Marple, that you had better stay here. This may become unpleasant." Miss Marple sat down again, folded her hands in her lap, and picked up her knitting. The grey shawl was finished, but the new socks for the vicar's nephew needed turning at the heel. The needles clicked steadily in the quiet room while they waited. Outside, the village went about its ordinary Monday business. The baker's boy whistled past on his bicycle. A dog barked somewhere near the church. And in the garden of Ivy Lodge, behind the neatly clipped hedge, a single light still burned in an upstairs window, though it was broad daylight. Miss Marple sighed once, very softly, and went on with her knitting. The end was very near now. The broken jar. Sergeant Cobb arrived at the surgery within 20 minutes, his heavy boots loud on the linoleum floor. He was a solid, slow-speaking man who had known St. Mary Mead all his life and liked his cases simple. This one, it seemed, was no longer simple. Dr. Giles showed him the broken pieces of glass that old Mr. Ted had found under the apple tree. A faint smear of orange marmalade still clung to the jagged edge. Sergeant Cobb turned the fragment over in his large hands and frowned. "Mrs. Pratt swears it's the same jar," he said. "Label matches what she remembers." but how it got into Ivy Lodge Garden is another matter." Miss Marple sat quietly in the corner, her knitting in her lap. She had not spoken since the sergeant arrived, but now she cleared her throat gently. "If I might suggest, Sergeant," she said, "perhaps we should ask Mrs. Cresswell herself. She is at home. I saw her not half an hour ago." Sergeant Cobb looked at her with the respectful wariness village policemen always showed Miss Marple. "You've been busy again, ma'am," he said, not unkindly. "Well, if you think it'll save time, we'll go round there now. But I'll do the talking if you don't mind." They walked the short distance together, the sergeant, Dr. Giles, and Miss Marple a little behind, her knitting bag swinging from her wrist. The afternoon sun had broken through the earlier mist and lay warm on the hedgerows. Everything looked exactly as it should on an ordinary Monday in St. Mary Mead. Yet Miss Marple felt a small, cold knot in her stomach. She had been so certain, and yet twice she had muddled the year of the Major's illness. What if this time, too, she had let a small mistake grow into a large injustice? Mrs. Cresswell opened the door at the first knock. Her face was pale but composed, the same tight bird-like expression Miss Marple had seen the evening before. "More questions?" she said, looking past the sergeant to Miss Marple. "I have already told you everything I know." Sergeant Cobb cleared his throat. "May we come in, madam? There's been a development about the missing marmalade jar. It turned up in your garden this morning. Broken. We'd like to know how it got there." For a moment, Mrs. Cresswell stood quite still. Then she stepped back without a word and led them into the sitting room. The photograph of the Major seemed to watch them from the mantelpiece. "I have no idea," she said, sitting down very straight in her usual chair. "Children, perhaps, or someone playing a prank. I threw nothing over the hedge." Miss Marple spoke then, her voice soft and almost apologetic. "I wonder, my dear, whether you remember helping Mrs. Pratt polish the brass the day after the doctor died. You were alone in the kitchen for a few minutes. The larder door was unbolted. It would have been so easy to slip the jar into your basket under the rice pudding cloth, and later, when the village was quiet, to throw it away where no one would look." Mrs. Cresswell's hands tightened in her lap. "You have a very vivid imagination, Miss Marple." Dr. Giles stepped forward. "The laboratory report came back half an hour ago, Mrs. Cresswell. There are traces of a vegetable alkaloid in the marmalade, the same kind that could cause sudden heart failure in an elderly man with a weak heart." The pinprick in Mrs. Ledbetter's jar was clumsy. "You meant only one jar to be poisoned, I think, but you were in a hurry." The room was very still. Outside, a thrush sang in the apple tree. Mrs. Cresswell looked at the photograph of her husband for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was flat, almost tired. "He killed my Arthur, you know, not with his own hands, but as surely as if he had." That summer of 1937, the Major had a fever no one could explain. Dr. Haydock called it malaria and dosed him with quinine for weeks. It was the wrong treatment. Another doctor, a stranger, saw at once it was a rare blood condition. If he had not come when he did, Arthur would have died. The doctor never admitted his mistake publicly. He let the village go on praising him. My husband carried the shame of it until the day he died. 16 years of quiet bitterness, and 16 years of watching that man walk about St. Mary Mead as though he had never done a wrong thing in his life. She drew a small, shaky breath. "I made 2 jars of marmalade that week. The second one I took to Rose Cottage myself. When Mrs. Pratt left me alone in the kitchen, I had the bottle of rat poison in my pocket. A few drops stirred in while the marmalade was still warm from the pan. It was easy, then I waited. When the doctor died, I took the jar away and broke it that same night. I thought no one would ever know." Sergeant Cobb shifted uncomfortably. "You'll have to come with me to the station, madam. There'll be formal charges." Mrs. Cresswell rose without protest. At the door, she paused and looked back at Miss Marple. "You were wrong about one thing," she said quietly. "It was not just a grudge, it was justice. Long overdue." Miss Marple met her eyes. "No, my dear," she answered gently. "It was never justice. It was only another mistake, and mistakes once made have a way of growing larger than we ever intended." The door closed behind them. Miss Marple stood alone in the tidy sitting room for a moment. She felt suddenly very old. She had been right about the marmalade, right about the poison, right about the long-buried grudge. Yet the victory tasted bitter. She had made her small slips with the dates, and each time Mrs. Cresswell had corrected her sharply. Those slips had been deliberate bait, but now they reminded her that even the cleverest of us can be wrong. She walked home slowly. The village was quiet. News had not yet spread. By evening, it would be on every doorstep. But for now, the lanes smelled of wallflowers and the church clock struck 5 with its usual calm note. At her own gate, Miss Marple paused. Cherry Baker was waiting with a tray of fresh scones. "Everything all right, miss?" the girl asked. Miss Marple smiled, a small, tired smile. "As right as it can be, Cherry. The marmalade pot has told its story at last." She went inside, sat down by the window, and picked up her knitting. The new socks for the vicar's nephew were almost finished. The needles clicked steadily in the quiet room, while the light faded slowly from the sky. Hidden grudges, she thought, were like weeds in an untended garden. Once they took root, they could choke even the kindest of lives. Dr. Haydock had lived with his mistake for 16 years. Mrs. Cresswell had lived with her bitterness for the same length of time. Both had paid a heavy price. Miss Marple sighed once, very softly, and turned the heel of the sock with careful fingers. Tomorrow, the village would talk, and then, in time, it would forget. Life in St. Mary Mead always went on. She reached for her ball of wool and noticed with a small start that she had used the wrong colour for 3 whole rows. A tiny mistake, easily unpicked. Miss Marple smiled to herself. Even she was not above the occasional error. It was, she reflected, what made one human. And with that gentle thought, she began to unravel the wrong rows, stitch by careful stitch, while outside the first stars came out over the peaceful roofs of St. Mary Mead.